Okay, I'm just gonna say it. Rey absolutely sucks.
That is a scientific fact!
There's likely never been a more divisive character in the history of cinema. Her introduction and subsequent focus in the Star Wars sequel trilogy has been the subject of debate ad nauseum for nearly a decade now. And with an announced Rey-centric film on the horizon, assuming it doesn't get shit-canned like other announced projects, it seems to be a trend that won't be ending anytime soon. But what is it that makes Rey such a controversial figure in Star Wars lore? And more importantly, is the hate justified? I do realize I'm a bit late to this party, but seeing as how I didn't have a channel back when the sequel trilogy was produced, I'll just have to make up for it now. Hopefully it was worth the wait.
Some say a waste of time, others say an incredible waste of time.
However, since it seems to be a permanent hot-button topic amongst the fandom, I see it as less of beating a dead tauntaun, and more like bringing my own spin to a debate that has no clear end in sight. When determining whether a character is well written, there's a multitude of criteria, of which fall into two categories, objective and subjective. As subjectivity by definition is unique to the individual, I can't very well use those as determining factors, so I'll focus on the objective ones. These include things such as a defined character arc and development, writing consistency, and quality, which are all key aspects to growth within a narrative. But where does one begin to tackle the Mount Everest of piss-poor writing? Maybe go with her increasingly bloated skill set, which moves from one unexplained ability to the next as the plot deems necessary.
Necessary for me to drink my own urine? No. But I do it anyway because it's sterile and I like the taste.
Nah. How about the way every single person is just enamored within moments of meeting her for seemingly no reason at all?
Hello?
I love you. Or perhaps the fact that she is evidently unable to fail at any task, regardless of there being zero semblance of any logical justification for her to accomplish these feats. Seriously, where should I start?
It's always best to start at the beginning.
Thank you, Strange Sparkle Lady from the Acid Trip Land. At the beginning of The Force Awakens, we're introduced to Rey, which ironically is the only well-written portion of her entire history. We see that she exists as an inhabitant on a planet called Jakku, a barren, arid desert world devoid of any meaningful resources outside of those which have been brought there. Left by her parents for an undisclosed reason, she has scraped by as a scavenger, pilfering parts and supplies from abandoned Galactic Empire tech which has remained peppered throughout the sands. She pines for a better life and meticulously etches the count of the days she has been waiting, giving us both the sense of her base skill set and the time of which it took her to fully acquire it. Right off the bat, this gives us a ton of information without saying a single word, and quite frankly is a fantastic setup for a character from a writing perspective. The audience is left with questions which we assume have answers on the horizon, and feel for this clearly down on her luck woman. We even get a brief glimpse of what her life might end up being if things don't change for her soon. Now let's take a look at how her introduction stacks up against the other protagonists in the saga. Luke Skywalker. He's young, whiny, and a bit impatient.
But I was going into Toshi Station to pick up some power converters.
We see that he exists as an inhabitant of a planet called Tatooine, a barren, arid desert world devoid of any meaningful resources outside of those which have been brought there. That sounds familiar. Living with his aunt and uncle, he has a quiet, boring life as a moisture farmer, but with a tendency to venture off and be a bit reckless. He pines for a better life and pleads with his family to allow him to join the nondescript academy. Along with his general obligations to the farm, he is shown to be a decent mechanic capable of making repairs to droids. On top of that, through dialogue it's revealed that he's an amateur pilot with skills far beyond that of your average hobbyist. These are all relevant to his journey and act as foreshadowing for things yet to come. There's also some additional foreshadowing here for his consumption preferences. Ugh. This is very similar to the way Rey is introduced, but does actually use a bit more of the tell not show method up front. However, this isn't really an issue as all the things we're told are eventually solidified later in the film. Last we have Anakin Skywalker. He's even younger, with skills far exceeding that which his age would ever indicate. We see that he exists as an inhabitant on a planet called Tatooine, a barren, arid desert world devoid of any meaningful resources outside of those which were brought there? Is there something wrong with the fucking printer? I think it keeps printing the same thing. Okay, seriously, I understand that I said that consistency was key, but this is getting just a bit out of hand here, guys.
What the hell's going on out here?
Living with his mother as a slave, he pines for a better life among the stars, but has zero conceivable way of doing so. He is shown to be an exceptional mechanic, and a decent pilot at pod racers.
You've never won a race?
Well, not exactly.
Not even finished?
Which is surprising, as humans often lack the required traits to do so.
I'm the only human who can do it.
You must have Jedi reflexes if you race bots.
Once again, like Luke, these traits are first mentioned and then later reinforced. Yeah, I know that was a bit strange to start with the most recent character first and then work my way backwards, but this is a video about how much Rey sucks after all. Also, trust me when I say that the original draft of this script had it in chronological order and it was an absolute mess. Can't very well critique poor writing by doing it myself now, can I? Anyway, back to Rey's origin story, and I know what you're thinking, because I thought about it the first time I saw The Force Awakens as well. Why would they basically recreate the same thing they did twice before? Wouldn't they be better served with a fresh new take? The short answer to the latter is yes. They would have been infinitely better off if they had gone that route. And for the former, the answer is very simple. Nostalgia, the crutch of the hack writer. Passing up on the chance to forge their own path, Abrams and co. decided to go with the familiar, and it's a real shame.
Shame! Shame!
There was a ton of potential here for Rey's homeworld to be similar to Hoth or Kashyyyk. Hell, even perhaps the moon of Endor where the completely illogical remnants of the Death Star inexplicably landed. You might be saying to yourself, that was a highly specific suggestion, Dark Hour. Is there any reason you chose that? Well, I guess you're just gonna have to stick around and find out. In a vacuum, Rey's origin is great for a multitude of reasons. It creates questions, encourages sentiments, and establishes boundaries for the character to overcome. It gives you everything you need for proper setups and payoffs. Unfortunately, as you'll find out through this series of essays, writing requires skill and planning, both of which eluded these productions like a fat guy avoiding a salad bar.
Yeah, it's a cantaloupe basket. It's very nice. Get out of the line.
Full disclosure, I usually avoid the salad bar too. Why am I harping on the starting point of the film for Rey, you might ask? Well, voices inside my head. It may seem insignificant, but it actually represents the earliest point in the trilogy of wasted potential. Now, I'm not gonna sit here and pretend that the original trilogy was this perfectly planned 3-part narrative with absolutely no flaws which make you cringe upon rewatch.
Leia's my sister.
Your insight serves you well.
Oh no. Oh no. Oh no.
But at least there was a general layout of how the story was gonna flow. Same goes for the prequel trilogy, poor dialogue and delivery aside.
I don't like sand. It's coarse and rough and irritating, and it gets everywhere.
From start to finish, it had a point that it was going toward, with the main and subplots flowing in a cohesive direction, with existing traits, character growth, and logic in mind. Subsequently, this is reflected in the basic ideas such as the languages that the characters speak. So let's take a look at one of the earliest canon examples of a character who speaks multiple languages, shall we? As stated earlier, Episode 1 introduced Anakin, who was living out his life as a slave under the shrewd shop owner Watto. From the get-go, we see that both of them speak English fluently, or as it's called in the Star Wars universe, Galactic Basic.
No money, no parts, no deal.
I heard the deep space pilots talk about that.
Galactic Basic is the de facto language most commonly spoken by people regardless of geographic or planetary location. It's not unlike many of the countries we see throughout the world today, which generally possess 1 or 2 official languages, but can have dozens of regional dialects and even pockets of their population which speak a foreign language. Seeing as how interplanetary trade and commerce is so important to the functions of the Star Wars universe's economics, it's no surprise to see a common language that's spread throughout the galaxy.
I listened to all the traders and star pilots who come through here.
Actually, there's a real-world example of this exact phenomena as recent as not even a century ago. As air travel expanded here in the 20th century on Earth, there were growing safety concerns over the ability for pilots and air traffic controllers to communicate. After the recommendation to use English as the de facto language to avoid these issues, it was widely accepted as the norm and slowly became a great example of English for a specific purpose. Seeing as how Tatooine is a hotbed for smuggling and trade, speaking Basic fluently is not only to be expected, it's almost a requirement. But what was said about Tatooine when they decided to touch down on this sand trap of a planet?
It's controlled by the Hutts.
Ah, yes, the Hutts, everybody's favorite opium-addicted slugs. And also a species that has its own language extremely different from Basic. From Sebulba to Watto, Anakin to the Hutts themselves, it's shown to be a widely accepted and utilized secondary language on the planet. If Tatooine was Canada, Huttese is their French.
You scrawny dope hot Slimo.
This extends to Luke in the original trilogy as well, though he seems a bit less fluent.
Nevertheless, I'm taking Captain Solo.
This is kind of the equivalent of that kid you grew up with who could understand his grandma speaking the language of the old country, but then one day you notice he never actually speaks it himself. So you ask him about it and he just says, I only really understand it. It's kind of like that. That's Luke in a nutshell when it comes to Huttese. This is actually fairly common for people who grow up in areas where language duality is the norm. Generational gaps tend to dilute languages and they begin to blend in very unique ways. I mean, who doesn't know somebody who speaks Spanglish fluently? So that effectively brings us to by far one of my favorite examples of a skill that makes zero fucking sense for Rey to possess. And that, my friends, is the ability to understand Shirawook, the primary language of the Wookiees.
You? No, it's true. We're the only ones on board. You can understand that thing?
Let's just think about this logically for 2 seconds, which is exponentially more than the writers did. Wookiees are native to Kashyyyk, a jungle world nowhere near Jakku. In fact, they aren't even on the same trade route. What are the odds that Rey would have encountered Wookiees? And even let's say one did happen upon the shithole she lived on. What are the chances of him, A, staying long enough to teach Rey his language, B, caring enough to teach Rey his language, or C, even having the ability to teach Rey his language? I'd venture a guess that a species of large, fur-covered jungle people have very little need to travel to a desert planet. Even assuming one did, odds are it would be very brief given their general temperature and moisture requirements, and lack of need of anything that the world could possibly provide for them. So I'd say it's safe to assume that Rey has had very little contact with Wookiees, if any at all. So with limited contact and zero immersion like the Skywalkers,
Rey Skywalker.
I meant the real Skywalkers, her odds drop to damn near zero for achieving even a casual understanding of Shirawook. Let's ground this in a little bit of reality, shall we? According to the Foreign Service Institute of the United States, a native English speaker would take approximately 24 to 30 weeks, or 600 to 750 hours to learn a Category 1 language. These include common languages encountered such as Spanish and French. This is not an insurmountable task by any stretch of the imagination. In fact, these are often languages a person could casually gain an understanding of through simply observing people using it. For instance, one might pick up a bit of Italian when working at a restaurant.
Scusi, babidi-boopy? Che cosa?
Peter, what are you doing?
Speaking Italian. Babidi-boopy? Babidi-boopity-babidi-babidi.
No, you wouldn't be considered proficient at the language, but at least you'd be able to grasp a few things. Actually, this is likely the way Luke and Anakin were able to learn Huttese. Seeing as how they had very little, if any, formal education, and both lived extremely busy worker lifestyles, the only conceivable way a person would be able to learn a language under those circumstances would be through association and osmosis. And this is especially doable for a Category 1 language. However, Shirawook is considered by far one of the hardest languages in the entire galaxy to learn. This would likely place it in the highest tier of the FSI, Category 5, which requires a staggering increase to 88 weeks or 2,200 required hours to achieve proficiency in. Once again, this is not impossible if you have a person capable and willing to teach you and the time to do so, or some degree of immersion. All of which are things Rey is extremely unlikely to have. So that's it, I'm calling bullshit on her understanding Shirawook on any level. You know what, let's take this outside of the Star Wars universe for a moment, and see if we can find another example from a better film worth discussing. I wonder if there's an instance of a person who seemingly out of nowhere has learned a new foreign language that we could delve a little deeper into.
Enrique! ¿Estás aquí? ¿Y tú? Siempre como culebra.
Qué bueno verte, Connor.
Dije que iba a regresar.
Hey, wait a minute, isn't that Sarah Connor, one of the members of the strong female character Mount Rushmore? So you're telling me we have another Mary Sue on our hands? Because there's no way they possibly accounted for that within the narrative.
Spent a lot of time in Nicaragua and places like that.
Okay, well I mean, that was off-screen, that's kind of a cop-out. Maybe Rey learned Shirawook off-screen. It's not like we ever saw Sarah struggling to learn Spanish.
Gasolina, por favor.
¿Cuánto?
Llena el tanque.
Fill it up, sí.
Okay, but what about that immersion requirement to make it conversational? John only said that they spent time in Nicaragua. Who's to say it was long enough to become fluent in a language she was clearly struggling to learn? Wouldn't she need to be in a location where Spanish was commonplace for an extended period of time? Huh? What do you have to say about that guy on the other side of the computer making graphics who happens to also be me? Yeah, I guess. Well then. Fine, you win. It seems like we actually had some good writing on our hands at one point.
Yo, Dark Hour, excuse me, do you mind if I cut in, sir?
Is that my friend Mr. Brown, owner and purveyor of the best hidden gem YouTube channel there is? Link in the description.
I just noticed you're getting very bogged down in array talk.
Well, I don't know if you read the title, and how could you? I'm recording it as we speak. But it is called Why Rey Sucks.
I am just concerned, my friend, for your mental health.
I do appreciate it, Mr. Brown, but I feel like this is something I just have to do. But I'm open to any suggestions.
I would suggest you move on.
Well, I guess I could take your advice for now and end this video. I really don't have much more to say about languages, but hopefully everyone who tuned in for this one likes it enough to tune in for part 2, where I talk about, well, her piloting skills and how that makes absolutely no goddamn sense. I really want to throw out a very special thank you to my friend Tyler Wolf. I had some severe technical difficulties with corrupted files and such, and had to pull the video down, and he helped me get it back up and running in a very tight window. I just want to thank him, and if there's anybody listening at this point, there's a link to his channel in the description. Please give him a watch and subscribe. Tell him Dark Hour sent you.